Welcome, everybody. So this is the Trees Are for the Birds webinar. We're really glad you could join us. My name is Brittany Like. I work with Detroit Audubon, but your speaker is Keith, and I'll let him take over.
Yeah, like Brittany said, my name is Keith Salowich. I'm the forester for the city of Novi. I've been doing that job for about 4 years now. It involves all of the maintenance of the city trees. We have about 40,000 of them, believe it or not, along our public roads in the rights of way, and also in city parks and other facilities. Maintenance involves, all the pruning we need to do, diagnosing for certain pests and diseases and that sort of thing, administering the removal of dangerous, dead, diseased trees, and then also, of course, planting new trees too, and also enforcing our woodland and wetland protections ordinance. I have a role in that too. So there's really quite a bit over in Novi to keep me busy, but I still like to try to carve out some time, every now and then to talk about these sorts of things, because this is why you get into the industry, right? Is to, protect nature, protect wildlife, support them in any way we can. That's what we're going to talk about today, specifically tailored for the birds, given the group I'm speaking to. So this is going to be a little bit of a, I'd like this to be somewhere else. This is going to be a little bit of a winding road through a few different topics concerning how trees and birds and the environment around them all kind of are interconnected. But I want to start briefly on some planting talk for a few reasons. Chiefly, really anyone can plant to support birds. When you think about planting for birds, a lot of people think about the huge, like 60-foot tall tree with birds perched all over in nests and lots of seeds and that sort of thing to eat. But really, it doesn't need to be that. While that's great and that's a good use of space, birds can also benefit from a lot of like ground cover type of plants or smaller shrubs or anything like that. For example, I'm going to talk about how this is all kind of related later on, but just a couple of weekends ago, I planted some of this butterfly weed, some seeds. This was $1.69 at Meijer and did not take very long at all. So really anyone can plant to support birds on their property. It's also a great time to plant right now. It's definitely warmed up considerably the last few weeks, as I'm sure you've all noticed. Well, in Michigan anyway, I know that there are some people further out than that. So now is a really great time to plant around where we're based here in Southeast Michigan. So when we're talking about planting for birds, there are a few things we want to provide. Obviously, we want to provide them with cover so that they can feel secure where they're roosting, flitting in between, hunting, looking for prey, all that sort of thing. They need that cover. And a good way to do that is sort of a multi-tiered landscape. So you've got the tall shade trees way up there. You've got the understory with shrubs or smaller trees. You've got some stuff on the ground going on. Really, all of those components help for birds to feel secure and give them that cover that they need. Also, nesting habitat. There are multiple types of nests. Obviously, different species form different nests, whether it's in a branch union or in a cavity of a tree, lots of cavity nesting birds. And then also they're going to need to eat, of course. So whether that be the nuts, the seeds, fruits, insects, all kinds of things like that. The greatest way, I believe, to kind of provide all of this multitude of different benefits is to plant a diversity of species. Again, that 60-foot tree is great for birds because, for perching, nesting, feeding, all that sorts of stuff. But if there's only one species, then you're really kind of limiting yourself in terms of what species are going to be drawn to the property and what species will benefit from that property. Diverse plant species build diverse food webs, and that's what's going to draw the wildlife. That's what's going to support them. So I'm going to click. All right, so how about this? Obviously a pretty huge property here. I don't know where this picture was taken because I stole it off the internet, but it's, massive property. Assuming it's in Southeast Michigan, like I said, where we're kind of based, This looks like it's probably a Japanese maple. This looks like probably a little clump of river birch. This is probably some spirea. We have some spirea that's native to the area, but more often than not, the stuff in the nurseries is from Japan. Not totally, can't really tell what this is, but these other plants we identified, none of them are native. This massive grass here that's regularly cut, probably, on a weekly basis, almost certainly fertilized, irrigated, weed killer goes down, insecticides go down, all to maintain that lush green carpet. When it's cut, they probably, collect the clippings, have them hauled away. It's essentially, in terms of ecological benefits, a wasteland. There's not a lot going on there to benefit native wildlife or healthy soil. You also notice we talked about cover being important for birds. Functionally none, maybe a little bit here and here near all this these windows and human activity. This is pretty exposed kind of on an island there. Really not a whole lot here that's going to draw in birds or other wildlife. Also, as that grass is growing up, being clipped, being hauled away, that's drawing nutrients out of the soil to grow that grass. And then when you chop and drop it elsewhere, that's taking those nutrients and getting them out of the area. So you're just repeatedly stripping the soil of all these important nutrients and biological material. And that really has kind of a domino effect on all of the microscopic life in the soil that, would make healthy soil. So good chance that when this was developed, all of that topsoil that was once there this was, again, assuming it's in Michigan, what we're going to do for these purposes, this was likely forested or covered in wildflowers of some kind. And, you strip all that away, strip away all the topsoil, compact everything down below it to regrade and lay foundation and all that. And then you bring in, a few inches of topsoil, get some grass going. We're going to move along, go develop the next property. So really, there's a lot of damage done to the soil, and that's where everything starts. That's where the plants start, and that's where the species, the birds that benefit from the plants, need to really be, the food web needs to be built up from the ground floor. Topsoil, what I'm talking about here, it's not the same thing as dirt. A lot of you guys probably know that, but they say that like a single gram of topsoil has just like an absurd amount of life in it. Billions of bacteria, thousands of protozoa, you got nematodes, you've got several yards of fungal hyphae, basically kind of like the roots of fungus, all within that single gram of healthy soil. It's insane to think about. It's a whole universe of life in this very small little pocket. A lot of that gets wiped away with our kind of tidy manicured lawns. So that's why it can be tough to get the native plants accustomed to that really ideal soil healthy system, acclimated to our built landscapes. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here, because landscapes lacking diversity, but especially native plant diversity, are really not doing a whole lot to support different bird species, but also wildlife at large. There are a few species that have really gotten good at adapting to human landscapes, one being the Michigan state bird, the American robin. Everyone knows what it looks like. They're everywhere. One of the reasons they're so ubiquitous is because they're really good at being generalists. They'll build a nest just about anywhere. Right now, my neighbor has one on top of his light post on his garage. The year before, we had one on the windowsill right outside of my shower. So they're gonna stick a nest anywhere they can keep it out of the rain, basically. And they also feed on a pretty wide variety of, food material. So they're very good at adapting. They're very good at being generalists. They are the exception and not the rule. Most birds are not so adaptable to built landscapes, especially our native birds. And birds with these more specialized habits that need a very particular, prey item or a very particular set of circumstances to nest, they are really going to struggle in our built environment that's, suited to human use. This is going back to the soil that we were talking about. This is an example of, you know, some healthy woodland soil, and you can see there's like so much junk in here, and that's just what we can see with like the naked eye. You know, you see your fungi here, there's bits of bark, some sticks, decomposing leaves, lichen, so much going on, so much underneath this in terms of like, you know, the detritivores, decomposers, all that microscopic life we talked about. Again, just a whole universe of life within this little small frame here. And that's really, really lacking in most of our built urban environments. A lot of people, this kind of stuff got a lot of press, I guess you could say, when the Wood Wide Web was being discussed a lot. That's basically the fungal hyphae. Again, you can kind of think about it as roots of the fungus, even though it's a little different than that. Basically, they either wrap around or even probe into the fine roots of plants. And they were doing this with trees, and they looked into it with trees. And these fungi and trees kind of interlock. And they're not just symbiotic with one another, you know, but that fungus is also connecting, you know, this tree to this tree, to this tree, to this tree, to this tree, all over this entire forest. And it's really making, you know, taking our previous experience of this tree being its own organism, one thing here, competition, and turning it into, reframing that perspective into this forest is a system. Everything is connected, everything relies on each other. And, you know, it's not all happy-go-lucky per se, but you can't have the forest without each of these factors in place. You need the leaf litter, you need the fungi in the soil, you need the trees. You know, it's hard to exist as a healthy forest without kind of everything lining up. And again, when we have these built landscapes, these lawns, there's not a lot of this action going on. So how can we recreate that without getting kicked out of our neighborhood by the HOA? It's not easy, because that lush green lawn is really kind of been painted as the ideal for a very long time, especially in neighborhoods with snooty neighbors. I was looking for a friendlier term, but mind your business, you know. You know, it can be tough to allow for this sort of thing when you have rules imposed by your city or by your HOA, or even just expectations by the surrounding neighbors. But there are ways to minimize the harm you do by not allowing for this to exist. One way that I've been doing the last couple of years is, you know, the leaves come down in the fall here in Michigan, and, you know, just I rake them into a pile, and I get most of them out of the front yard, and then I haul them into my backyard where people can't look in and judge me for lazy gardening practices. And I spread them around, or I put them in a pile here that's going to be a future, you know, wildflower bed, or stick them back in this corner where they can kind of do their thing. Because there's a lot of life that overwinters in down, fallen debris, be it leaf litter or otherwise. And when you rake them all up, send them away, that's all, you know, going away. It's going to overheat in a big compost heap, or it's going to get shredded, or whatever ends up happening. That kills off all of that insect life trying to overwinter in that. Because I mean, at the end of the day, this is habitat. This is feeding the soil with nutrients. It's feeding those decomposers. It's allowing, like I said, small insects to overwinter in there. It's habitat, and we're stripping it away when we, you know, keep our lawns too tidy. So, you know, kind of advocating for laziness. That's one way to put it. But at the end of the day, it's not laziness, it's intentional preservation of habitat, and it's so important. So I encourage you to think about ways you could do this at you know, on your property, again, without getting the boot from the HOA. This is furthering my point on lazy gardening practices. I want to talk about dead trees for a second. It's something I deal with a lot in my job. Again, I'm the city forester, and a big part of being an urban forester is reducing risk to the public. These are publicly owned trees. We don't want them falling into people's houses or crushing their cars or doing anything like that. So we're always looking to reduce risk when we can. oftentimes, because of where these trees are planted in urban environments, near homes, near cars, near driveways, near playgrounds, you know, traditionally it's been, that tree is a problem, get it out of here, let's remove it. I'm challenging people to look beyond that as a one size fits all option. Tree risk, I feel, is often overstated and can almost be used as a scare tactic. I know that's kind of like a big, strong word to use in that place, but I really think that an unfounded fear oftentimes guides people's decisions, and ultimately that decision is generally cut the tree down. Tree risk is not just the likelihood of a tree to fail. It's the likelihood of the tree to fail plus the likelihood of that tree impacting a target and the severity of that impact. So if you have a dead tree, fully dead, it's been dead for years, it could come down at any time. It could come down in the next windstorm, it could come down in 2 minutes in calm conditions because it's decayed, it's rotten, whatever. But if that thing is 200 feet away from the nearest home and it's leaning into the woods where it's not going to fall on a patio or anything like that, the likelihood of that tree impacting a target is very, very low. So ultimately, despite the fact that that tree probably will come down sometime soon, it's a low risk tree because the side of the risk that impacts people, targets, etc., is very low. So, in Novi, I've been making a big push to preserve these dead and damaged trees where we can safely. I mean, at the end of the day, safety is still the name of the game, but there are ways to do it that don't always necessitate full tree removal. Another one that I've really been implementing quite a bit is, say we have a dead tree and it's, not 200 feet away, it's 50 feet away from a house. Okay, well, can we lop off the top of it and drop that into the woodland, behind their house or whatever? And then that can decompose there. We'll leave it for habitat down on the ground. And this standing dead trunk, which is so vital as habitat, can be allowed to stand because the likelihood of that failing, A, is way lower because it's not catching as much wind, there's less load on it, everything like that. It's lower to the ground. B, now it can't reach the house. Now it can't reach the pool. Now it can't reach the playground. So even if it does fail, the likelihood of impact and the severity of impact so low that it ends up being a low risk tree. And that trunk gets to remain standing. And standing deadwood is so important. You just ask our pal here, he would agree. Because it welcomes insects. Insects love getting into decayed wood, all kinds of different borers do it, all kinds of stuff. And it kind of acts as like a buffet, for woodpeckers, all kinds of different birds. And then also we talked about different nesting habits of different species. A lot of species, most notably a lot of them that use different types of birdhouses and stuff. Birdhouses are made, many of them, to simulate a cavity in a piece of standing deadwood. So these cavity nesters, woodpeckers, wood ducks, kestrels, bluebirds, all those sorts of things rely on standing deadwood. And in the absence of that, I guess, birdhouses that people put up. But if you already got the standing deadwood, it's better to leave that in place, keep it up in a way that's safe so that it can feed birds, it can house birds, all that good stuff. And again, that might be looked at as lazy gardening or lazy land maintenance or whatever, but it's not lazy, it's intentional, it's important, it's habitat preservation. So it's really just about reframing the way you think about it. Now we can go to this slide. I already told you a little bit about Ptolemy. He's written 4 books. This is one of them, probably the most famous of the bunch. So he wrote those books about the importance of native ecology. As it says here, he's an entomologist, so he's got kind of an interesting spin on it because his focus is really on the insect bedrock foundation of food webs. How do we plant species that support the insects that support the rest of the wildlife, macrofauna that we're interested in seeing, bringing to our yard, etc. He is also kind of the chief driver of the Homegrown National Park movement, which is basically about saying, look, these national parks we have, they're great, they're untouched, they're wild, everything there is cool, but it's just not enough because we have migrating species that need to cross, sometimes thousands of miles. And if they have this national park here and they have to fly 2,000 miles to the south and cross nothing but suburbia and metro areas, there's no chance they're making it. So it's all about creating little pockets of habitat for native wildlife to kind of simulate the whole of what it used to be before development, chopping it up into smaller pieces. So that's kind of been his big message. This is something of a movement. You can read more about it online if you just look up Homegrown National Park Movement. You can get your property on the map, so it kind of validates your efforts. You get to see other little pockets of habitat around that are kind of chasing the same dream we all are, of supporting biodiversity and helping out these species. So 2014, research suggested that insect populations have declined by 45% since 1974. That varies by location in the world, of course. Some have lost more, some have lost less. There's been a lot of research since then, and they come up with varying numbers. But I have not come across anything that says insect populations are going up. It's all been, on the downturn as far as what I've seen. Some more than this 45%, some estimated at less. But regardless, the trend is not looking great, especially because, as I talked about and as Talamy taught us with his research, insects play such an important role in forming the food webs. They are the foundational species for, everything above it in that food web. Of course, they're being threatened by, the things you'd expect: habitat loss, climate change, insecticide use, all that sort of stuff. But the reason people should be way more freaked out about this, and I know that climate change is important too. That is something to worry about. That gets a lot of press, a lot of, political yammering back and forth on it. Me and you, all of us collectively, there's not a ton we can do about climate change, right? We can implement changes in our own lives, but in terms of widespread change, that's going to need to be more of a group effort than the 30 of us in here or whatever. Biodiversity loss is different because you can have an impact on your local species today by helping to preserve the habitat like we talked about, by helping to plant for wildlife using native species. Again, this Homegrown National Park movement, the reason it's so cool is it doesn't take every single person on the block to do it. You can create habitat, and then your neighbors 3 doors down can create habitat, and you kind of go that way. You connect it to a woodland, and pretty soon you've got this whole sort of network of connected habitat that really helps these species along. So you can have such an outsized impact on this as an individual, whereas with other environmental issues, it's much more difficult. The most important species that Talamy focuses on are lepidopterans, which are moths and butterflies. We'll get into why they're so important, why they have such a large impact, even relative to other insects in a little bit. But just to run through, there's about 180,000 species of butterflies and moths on the planet. A little less than 1,000 have been reported in Michigan here. I'm not sure about Seattle. I'm sorry about that. But, sorry, I haven't been scrolling on my notes as we go along. But the reason that these lepidopterans are so important and have such an outsized impact relative to other insects is because, when we're talking about birds specifically, birds can eat a pretty wide variety of things, all kinds of nuts, seeds, fruit, whatever. The young need to have a very nutrient-rich diet. They grow fast, some clutches reared within a little more than 2 weeks. So they need high protein, high fat diet. And one of the great ways to do that birds take advantage of are caterpillars, which of course are the younger stage of the lepidopterans. Takes up to, this is staggering. This is something that you wouldn't believe if I hadn't fact checked it on a bunch of different sites, but it takes up to 9,000 caterpillars to raise 1 clutch of chickadees to maturity. That is bananas. They're so small. They're so hungry. They can't get enough. but like, again, it all happens very fast from hatch to fully fledged. So to keep up that manic phase, that manic growth, they really need a lot of protein and a lot of fat. And that 9,000 number, it's huge. It can vary a little bit by the amount of chickadees in a single clutch, but still, multiple thousands to get them to fully mature. And in order to support, that amount of caterpillars to support the birds that we want to see, those caterpillars need something to feed on. So that's where this website comes in. It is, and I don't even think they sell anything, and they don't certainly don't sponsor scrubs like me or anything. So it's not like I'm plugging something here. It's just this really awesome resource that I use a lot. It's called Native Plant Finder. You can just punch that into the Google machine and it'll take you there. It's all based on Doug Tallamy's research, that entomologist we discussed. And it's the best place I've found to start looking for native plants that support native lepidopterans, and by extension, our young birds, so that they can successfully raise a clutch of eggs. Here are some quick stats. You can dive into the numbers on the actual website, that Native Plant Finder website. But this is for my area. Let me back up. One of the great things about this website is you in Seattle can punch in your zip code, and this will tell you the species that work best for your direct, very local area. These species here are what work best for my area of Southeast Michigan. So it lists all the species that are supported by the different species of plant. And you can kind of see the top 5 of each category here, what supports the most. For us, goldenrod is the highest in terms of herbaceous plants. And then in terms of woody trees and shrubs, you got oaks with really a massive impact. So many species benefit from oaks. One of Tallamy's books is specifically about the oak genus. It doesn't talk about anything else. He just loves oaks, and you should too, because of this number here. They are so important, so good at creating habitat and food web with oak at the center. Of course, a lot of these plants are also going to benefit pollinators too. That's another one that gets a lot of press and a lot of enthusiasm, which is good. Pollinators are important. This is some Joe Pye weed I planted last year, for example, and some kind of native sweat bee here. I am not an entomologist, so I I'm not going to get too in the weeds on IDing it, but pretty cool. You get to help out the pollinators, you get to help out the lepidopterans, and by extension, everything else in the natural world around you. This is a quick example of what that Native Plant Finder website looks like. I made this picture small because it is kind of blurry, but it's not that important. I mostly just wanted to show you what kind of info it contains. This, shows that native birch species in our area, which include bog birch, paper birch, yellow birch, and a different variety of yellow birch. I know that font is very small, but so native birch in this area attract 403 species of butterflies and moths because they use the caterpillar, use it as a host plant. So it's another one of those species that provides for a huge diversity of lepidopterans and all the things that spiral off of that. And then it'll show you a few different examples of the butterflies and moths you might see popping up around your birch trees. Another kind of cool feature, which again is just like validation for your efforts, you can make an account and save, that's what this button is here, the different plants you have on your property, and you can kind of keep a running total of like, wow, I'm supporting 403 species with this and 220 with this, and it's just kind of cool to keep an eye on. And it helps remind you of what you have growing in your yard, because I have done this, and I'm sure many of you have. You go to the nursery, get all fired up about planting some stuff, stick it in the ground, throw away the tag, and then next year you're like, what the heck is that? So this helps you remember. This is a little bit of a detour, but I couldn't find where to put this in the talk, but I really wanted to talk about it. A lot of people talk about, this is visible. Hopefully that's not too distracting, folks. A lot of people talk about junk trees. That's a term that I hear all the time in my job from residents who want to cut down their cottonwoods or their black locust or whatever. They call them junk trees, and it drives me nuts. There are very, very, very few trees that I would call junk trees. It's like, you know, Bradford pear and then not a whole lot else. Because a lot of the classic junk trees that people want taken down because they're messy or they have weak wood or they draw in box elder bugs or they surface root or anything like that really are native species that have a huge, you know, provide huge benefits for our native insects and wildlife. For example, the aspen and the box elder and black locust and honey locust, which is what this is here. I mean, all of these play host plant to a ton of species. So they're all really good at building up those food webs and providing for all the wildlife and insects that we like. So, you know, it's just junk trees drive me nuts. I don't like hearing it about native species specifically because they have their purpose, and native insects and native wildlife don't think they're junk. They think they're great. This is kind of a message to think about. We've looked at a lot of species briefly that, you know, some of them benefit 400 species, some of them benefit, you know, on that website, like 1 or 2. It's important to plant for the specialists because that in turn will also feed the generalists. If we think back to the American robin, it's really good at making its living on just about anything. I mean, it'll make a nest anywhere, it feeds on all kinds of different stuff. It's good at being a generalist, and there are a lot of different generalists out there. So trying to help them out doesn't make as much sense as trying to help out the specialists, which are not so adaptable and need more specific circumstances to survive. So for example, there's something called the hackberry emperor butterfly here in Michigan, and it gets its name because its only host plant is a hackberry, the tree, hackberry trees. It can't, you know, its young can't survive on anything else. So if it doesn't have hackberry trees, you don't have hackberry butterflies, hackberry emperor butterflies. So plant for those specialists, which really need, you know, certain specific conditions and species, and then that'll in turn also help the generalists that can make their living on many other things. Obviously, this coin, you know, there's another side to it, kind of goes both ways. Trees need birds just like birds need trees. A lot of them, obviously, you know, seed dispersal, birds coming up, eating the fruit, eating the berries, eating the seeds, the nuts, whatever, going out there, pooping them on the ground like good birds, you know, for that dispersal. That's really important, that symbiosis. And birds may also eat, you know, some insects that harm trees. That happens now and then. So that helps out the tree too. The tree provides back with this habitat and food, and, you know, they have this, oh, well, thank you very much, bird. Thank you, Mr. Tree. Yeah, we'll see you again next time. You know, it works out. Trees also are really great for adding vertical space to your property, garden, landscape, etc. A lot of people, you know, the head is down. It's, well, I can plant some, you know, some butterfly weed here. I can plant a spice bush over here. And then I'm kind of out of room because there's already something here. But you got to look beyond that. You got to think up. Trees can add all kinds of great vertical space to your landscape. So you're operating in 3 dimensions and not just in terms of ground area. So I challenge you to kind of expand your perspective on that too. How can I create better habitat above my head while also, you know, working on stuff down here that I can get on my knees and my hands in the dirt and work on that stuff. Going back to talking more about planting, now that I've given you that whole, you know, winding insect diatribe, it's so important to think about, you know, the slogan for a while now in the industry has been right tree, right place. Before we plant, before we think about what species we want, we got to know what site conditions we're working with. So know if this area you want to plant gets sun, what, you know, does it have southern exposure where it's going to get a ton of sun, there's nothing blocking it, or does it have northern exposure, it's kind of behind your shed and there's going to be like hardly any sun to speak of back there. Because, you know, trying to force a sun-loving plant into a shady spot is a big, you know, circle hole square peg situation. It's not going to work, and you can try to force it, but the plant is going to be small, not grow well, unhealthy, probably die, etc. You also got to think about your soil conditions. Do you have clay? Do you have sand? That sort of thing. You got to think about how much water does this tend to hold? Is it a low spot where water, you know, tends to sit for multiple days in a row often? You know, all that stuff. And I also want everyone to really think about the size of plants at maturity. Not what does this look like at present, at this moment, but what is this going to look like 30, 40 years from now when it's, you know, reaching its max size? Because so often, again, being an urban forester, I see people that want to plant a hedge to shield themselves from a major road or something like that. So it's, oh, I got this Colorado blue spruce, which are not so good to plant around here in Michigan. I got this Colorado blue spruce. I'm going to plant them pop, 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 all right next to each other. I have this awesome hedge. This is going to be great. These trees are going to get bigger and bigger, and I'll have more and more privacy. But that's not what happens, because they don't plan for what these trees are going to be at maturity. They grow into one another. There's no air movement. Fungal diseases run rampant. Needles start dropping. Trees get unhealthy. Trees start dying off. And suddenly you're back to square one with no hedge whatsoever, because you couldn't think ahead. What is this tree going to look like as it grows? Where is it going to, you know, spread its branches and all that sort of thing? So that goes into right tree, right place. Think about the tree at its max height, its spread at, you know, its max spread at maturity, and also think about different utility or infrastructure conflicts. I deal with it a lot because a lot of our trees are street trees. You know, they're between the road and the sidewalk, usually like 8 to 15 feet, depending on the neighborhood. And you run into conflicts with sidewalks and edge drains and all that sort of thing. Ideally, you guys won't have to deal with that as much, because there's not as much of that going on in, you know, backyards or closer to, you know, further up into front yards. But still, you know, it's important to think about, don't plant a tree a foot off of your house's foundation. It's probably not a great idea. And definitely, you know, if you're going to be doing any kind of major excavation, you always want to give Mystic a call to make sure you're not going to stick a shovel through your neighbor's gas line or whatever, because that's no way to make friends. Right tree, right place. A little bit more on planting. I usually tell people, you're already going through the effort, the time, the money, buying the tree, getting it in the ground. Go like that little bit extra, couple inches, you know, spend an extra buck, set them up for success. I always recommend that woody trees and shrubs be mulched. It, you know, is about the best we can do to simulate that healthy soil that we looked at, that leaf litter with the sticks and the bark and all that good stuff. Mulch is kind of the way we do it in urban landscapes, kind of simulate that. It's important to do it properly. Definitely don't volcano mulch. That's when you've got mulch piled up right against the trunk of a tree or a shrub. You can just look up volcano mulching and you'll have like 80 billion people yelling at you on the internet to not do it, myself included. So save yourself the trouble and just, you know, learn how to mulch properly before you do it. 2 to 3 inches, leave a little bit of a basin so that air can circulate, but also water is kind of directed down into the root zone. And that's about all you need. Generally, you don't have to reapply mulch every year. The people who do are the people that tend to have, you know, several inches of it. And then that really restricts water penetration down into the roots and restricts, you know, gas exchange and all that sort of stuff. So 2 to 3 inches is really all you need. Young woody plants are, you guys probably have experienced this, pretty vulnerable to all kinds of herbivores around here. By me, again, in Southeast Michigan, it's rabbits, squirrels, deer, all the, you know, kind of classic annoying critters get into your stuff. They're not annoying, but they are when they eat your new shrubs. So do what you can to prevent that. You know, get something like this, a little bit of chicken wire, or they make even, you know, if you have larger trees, smaller deer guards that go right up against the bark. And that'll preserve them, you know, those buds and twigs and bark and roots and all that stuff that those things like to eat. That kind of keeps them at bay until they can get established. And then once you got a nice big healthy tree, then you can say, all right, guys, go ahead. You can eat a little bit. Now you're not going to kill the whole plant, for an afternoon snack. And save yourself the heartache doing that. Like I said, it's a few bucks extra, and you don't have to go through the experience of caring for, nurturing, planting, paying for. Finally, I'm seeing some growth on this service berry or this 9-bark or whatever. Oh, it got eaten overnight. Back to square one. So caging's good. One last thing on this. I like stuff with holes in it, so you can still get that air movement, that circulation. Sometimes people do burlap on the trunk. I really don't like that as much. It traps moisture, and that can facilitate some rot and bark damage and stuff like that. So stuff with holes tends to be better. And finally, commit to a watering regimen. This one should be basic. Everyone should know this. When you put in new plantings, those roots are not super developed. They were probably getting, meticulous round the clock, not that extreme, but meticulous care at the greenhouse or nursery or wherever they were grown. They were on a very regular watering regimen. And now you've pulled them from that, stuck them in a new hole, and you got to keep that care up until those roots get developed at least. So what I usually tell people, if you're dealing with trees, if you go about, 7 days or so, give or take, and it's been hot out, there's not really been any rain, this thing's been getting blasted by the sun, you're going to want to get out there with the hose and just let that puppy run for like a few minutes, like several minutes, to really make sure that water seeps down into the roots. Once upon a time, another forester told me that their recommendation for people is hose in one hand and then open a beer in the other. And as long as it takes you to drink the beer, that's how long you water the tree. So I don't know how applicable that is for anyone. I feel like that time can vary, but I don't know. He stuck by that, and it seems to work out for him. So make sure you've committed to a watering regimen. It's part of your plan's post-planting care. Finally, my last point I want to talk about briefly here are invasive species, because they do threaten local ecology. I'm going to describe briefly the buckthorn shrub, which is invasive here in my part of Michigan, and it runs rampant. And the city of Novi, where I work, spends a lot of money every year trying to remove it from our parks because it is bad for our ecology. But to describe this shrub, it forms pretty dense thickets. It has thorny branches, and it produces fruit that birds eat. So it sounds great, because like that cover is there. The thorns help them be protected from predators. They can eat on the fruit, get fat and happy doing that. But ultimately, buckthorn and other invasive species like it are harmful to our ecology. And you have to look beyond, again, the immediacy of here and now. Yes, this is providing good cover in this dense thicket, but because it's dense and because it puts on leaves early and keeps them late, it's not allowing for any native growth beneath it to come up. Buckthorn even has what's called allelopathic chemicals that it secretes out of its roots that restrict, what's the right word? I'll go with restrict. Limit the amount of growth from other plants. It's like it stunts the growth of other plants, these chemicals it releases. And it forms these dense thickets. So it's outcompeting all these native species that could better serve these birds and other wildlife. In terms of the berries, yes, it feeds the adults. They can make their living on that. But the young that need those high protein, high fat caterpillars, other juicy insects like that, those insects can't use these exotic invasive plants as host plants. There are far fewer that can. Only those few generalist insects can. And those are, fewer and far between. Again, like the robin, those are the exception, not the rule. Most species are more specific to host plants. So planting native and allowing native plants to grow is the best way to kind of cover the most, species diversity as possible. And then, of course, the birds eating the fruit, they fly off and they poop, and then there's more buckthorn over there, and then we got to spend more money cleaning up out of this park now. So it's a fight, and I encourage you to learn about, if you are in Southeast Michigan like me, learn about what these kind of most infamous species look like. This is what we tackle the most in Novi in terms of woody plants. There are lots of herbaceous ones too. But learn what these look like, because if they're not in your yard right now, then they probably will try to get established at some point. And like anything else, if you can, knock it out before it gets too well set up and spread, that's going to be easier than trying to control something once it's already really taken over. A couple birds here, they're perched on buckthorn. They're feeding buckthorn. Oh man, they're eating the buckthorn fruit. They're gonna fly off. That's gonna be a new shrub. Oh no, stop it. Not helping. So the takeaways on this talk. Of course, off the top, we talked about reducing the amount of grass. Grass really does not do much at all to support wildlife. It, in most cases, actively harms soil health, which already is so devastated in urban areas through compaction and topsoil removal and all that. Try to embrace that mess. Those lazy gardening practices we talked about, don't rake your leaves, don't pick up every stick, or if you do, just stick them in a different part of the yard. That's not going to bother you. Just let them go. They'll break down, they'll feed the soil. All the little critters will overwinter in there. I think some of our native bees may do that. Don't hold me on that. Like I said, I'm not an entomologist. But embrace that mess. Plant native plants. They can actually really, really frustratingly be kind of hard to find, but there are some native plant nurseries around here. Barson's greenhouse by me has a lot of native plants. I know there's Wild Type Nursery. I think that's around the Ann Arbor area. They tend to have a lot. A lot of cities and counties oftentimes will do like native plant sales or native plant giveaways. That sort of thing. And, if you're absolutely, out of options, you can always order online. It can get a little dicey with shipping live plants, but, that is an option too. And you can check to see if something is native. So many times I've been in Home Depot for something and it's like, oh, well, let's check out the garden center. And it's like, hey, I think this thing is native. I might buy this. And then you pull up Native Plant Finder, punch in your zip code. What do you know? It feeds 46 different types of lepidopteran caterpillars. Boom, add it to the cart. Let's get that in the ground. So, something to think about there. And plan for diversity, of course. Diverse species helps establish diverse food webs, encourages more species, yada, yada. And finally, what we just talked about, invasive plants do damage our natural areas. They're ultimately harmful for our birds. And you really should try to control them both on your property. And if you're really, seeing the horrors of invasives and you want to try to do more to stamp them out, a lot of places do, garlic mustard pole, all kinds of different buckthorn removal volunteer opportunities. So, keep your eyes out, look for some stuff like that. And with that, we've reached the end of my talk. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to field them either now or later on. But otherwise, thanks so much for those who stuck around.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, so I guess I'm going to start from the beginning. So a lot of people were asking if this will be available later. Yes, we are recording actively now. And so I will share this on the Detroit Audubon webpage. We'll put it on YouTube. I'll send it to everyone that registered ahead of time in the Eventbrite information. And then also I'll share it with Keith. And so that way, if he wants to share it wherever it's maybe the City of Novi webpage or wherever they want to, they can do that too. So let's see down further. Lots of reactions. I don't know if any of you thought, but I love Keith as a presenter because he always makes me laugh. I love it. It's relatable. Great job, Keith. Let's see. So a lot of people were saying they're really appreciative of that. Richard put compost bins with worms can be dumped around the base of tree as well, and that helps. The only thing to be aware of with worms is you want to reduce the chance of spreading some invasive worms. So make sure they're the more native species. So that's always something to keep in mind. One thing I wanted to kind of add, Keith, for some of you, if maybe you have a slightly bigger piece of property, or maybe you just you're worried about spending a ton of money on mulch for some of your trees, shrubs, and plants. A lot of times forested companies, cities, they'll usually provide wood chips for free to either be dropped off or for you to pick them up for free. So you don't have to go to stores and spend an arm and a leg on just a single bag of mulch. You can get it for free in other ways. And so make sure you keep that in mind. I know I actually just contacted a company. I'm getting a whole truckload of it for my yard. And I can't wait to put it around all of my trees. And so that's just a waiting game for them to chop up a tree and get it to my yard. So those are options. Richard also put, speaking about invasive species, thanks to Russia, we have tumbleweeds all over the West, which left a ship in the Great Lakes. And so yeah, tumbleweeds. So you know those lovely Western movies where you all of a sudden see this lovely tumbleweed just rolling across the screen. People see it as like kind of iconic of the West, and it's actually, again, like he said, it's invasive. It's bad. I kind of cringe if I see it in a Western movie. It's like, oh, geez, they don't even know it's bad. Carol put wild type is in Mason, southeast of Lansing. So wild type is probably one of the best places to buy native plants in Michigan. Even if you have to spend a whole day and you want to just maybe go get lunch, go over there, really just have a wonderful time going plant shopping, wild type is the place to go. Barson's greenhouse in Garden City is another pretty good option. They usually have a really nice selection of native plants if you're in the Detroit metro area.
Yeah, that's where I go. And they tend to get a lot of stuff from wild type too, I think.
Yeah.
So they've got good options.
Another good place, conservation districts. Your local conservation district will sell native trees, shrubs, and other plants that they do that sale usually twice a year, and they're pretty good priced. But it's a fundraiser to support the conservation districts, and you get native plants out of it. And so it's always a fun way. Friends of the Rouge does a sale every spring and fall, where they'll also sell rain barrels, which is another great way to recycle your rainwater instead of upping your water bill. Richard mentioned that I believe he's referring to the tumbleweeds, but he put these explode in a wildfire. So gotta love those invasives. I don't know what the name says, but they put, what do you think of bird feeders? Do they help with the bird populations, or is it better to rely on native plant material?
Yeah, so I'll speak to that briefly because I just read some stuff from Michigan's DNR about it. Recently, this avian flu stuff has been going around, and I was reading that they're actually encouraging people to either take down their bird feeders temporarily until they kind of get through that wave, or to make sure that they're really well cleaned, because, you know, in terms of what's better, native plant material or bird feeder, I'm always going to lean native plant material. It's always, you know, better than natural state of things. What we do with nesting boxes and bird feeders and that sort of thing is try our best to simulate the benefits of these natural setups. And we don't, you know, we can only do so good a job at it. So bird feeders, while they can be beneficial for sure, you got to make sure to be careful with them in terms of, you know, spreading disease, drawing in predators, that sort of thing. And if you can, you know, not necessarily cut them off all at once, but maybe wean off of them a little bit. Don't rely on them so much to feed your birds on your property, and start getting some native plants established. I think that's going to definitely be the better option.
I would definitely second that, Keith. Good, all good points. I would say if you're still establishing a yard, bird feeders are great, especially if it's a central point to really be able to see the birds, because when you have your trees and shrubs, ideally they're going to be spread out across your yard, so you won't always see all of those birds. So it is a good place if you want to see them. But as a whole, if you're wanting to support a population of birds and other species, I agree. Native plants are always the #1 best thing you can do. The bird feeders are ideally more for humans, but it is a good in-between as you establish your own property. Another question from Lori is, which does best in Southeast Michigan, redbud, serviceberry, or dogwood as a small front yard tree?
Yeah, so that is really going to, I don't mean this to be like a cop-out answer per se, but that's really going to depend on your conditions. Like I said, you know, right tree, right place. We're thinking about what's your soil like, how much sun is this getting, you know, that sort of thing. We plant all three of those in Novi. I would say of those three, serviceberry tend to be the least finicky. Redbud and dogwood can be a little bit harder to get established. I think maybe they are wanting for a little bit more water than what they would normally get on our roadside plantings. All of these trees are understory trees, so they're going to like a little bit of shade. It's going to be tough to get them going in, super direct, bright, full sun. Especially again, if that's not the way they were grown in the nursery. So I don't think that there's an easy one size fits all answer to that. It really depends on your site. I will say though, obviously there's a lot of diversity in the dogwood, in terms of dogwoods, that Cornus genus. I think they have like the 5th or 6th greatest number of caterpillar species that use it as a host plant in my area here. So I've planted some, some of the red osier dogwood. I've got some silky dogwood, got a flowering dogwood in the back, so a few different types of that same genus. And those have all done pretty well where I am. Where you are, it may vary a little bit. And I would encourage you to look into each plant's needs and what conditions you have, currently.
I guess I'll add on to that a little bit, just for people to be aware of. Each species, kind of bringing back up what Keith mentioned, is each species does get to different sizes. So like keeping in mind, serviceberry does tend to get pretty wide and tall. So making sure you have the space for it, so that way you're not unhappy or needing to trim it too much. Certain varieties of dogwoods tend to be a little smaller versus others get bigger. So make sure you really look into what size they will become when you're planting, because you may get excited and want to plant it right in front of your house, but if it gets 10, 15, or even 20 feet tall, you want to really be careful, because even if the root, you can trim up the leaves and the branches if you really needed to, but you have to be concerned about the root system and how that may damage your house under the ground. So keeping that in mind is always good, just as he said. Richard asked, all red wigglers aren't the same, ? So Keith, did you want to talk about that, or did you want me to?
I'm no expert in that field, so I will happily pass the buck if you want to speak to it.
That's okay. I don't fully know the answer to that, Richard, but I do know there are a wide range of different worms. Red wigglers are known as more of the native species here, but you want to be careful. Some people may go and try and find worms in general, and they think that they're all native, but a lot of the typical worms that you have digging in your yard typically are the invasive species. And so you want to just be careful that if you are composting and you're purchasing worms for a vermicompost pile, which that's a worm compost pile, you do want to be careful about what species you use. Southeast Michigan group, they put, do you find that topsoil is stripped by contractors at construction sites? Do they then sell the topsoil they take away?
Yeah, isn't that like a great business sense by them and horrible for all of us? Oh man, what a good idea they had to ruin our landscape. Yes, in my experience, that I don't know how many of them are directly selling it after the fact, but in order to grade the property the way they need to develop it, oftentimes the top several inches of topsoil are stripped away, leaving only the pretty barren stuff devoid of biological material behind.
Yeah. So Anne has a question, but afterwards, if you could just put it in the comments. She put, what is the website for the native trees or shrubs for geographic area?
Yeah, so again, that's, I don't know the full URL, but it's Native Plant Finder. I dropped that into the chat a little further down. If you just punch in Native Plant Finder, it's through the NWF, the National Wildlife Federation. You should be able to find it pretty easily that way. Perfect.
Carol, she had a comment back to what I said earlier. She put, be careful with conservation districts. They have a lot of natives, but some are not. So you do want to kind of check on that a little bit. But they are a good place to get a decent amount of natives. She put back in the 70s, they talked me into planting autumn olive, a very bad move on my part. So the other thing to consider though is that things have changed over the years. So back in the 70s, people weren't really aware of how bad autumn olive was. And so it was encouraged, but the chances of you finding them selling that now is, in my opinion, probably impossible because things do change. They used to think autumn olive and buckthorn were beneficial. Honeysuckle in particular they thought was beneficial, but times do change. Research does show that it's not always good, and that maybe back then it was, but now it's not. And so just keeping it in mind that is probably part of it.
I would also, just to add on to that, a little bit caution that things do change, as Brittany said. Unfortunately, they can be a little bit slow to change. So if I wanted to, I could hop in the car, drive 5 minutes down the road and still buy a Bradford pear tree. And, you know, we should know by now that those are quite problematic in terms of outcompeting natives, becoming naturalized and taking over areas. Not to mention their, you know, weird smelling flowers and weak wood that grows with terrible form and falls to pieces and causes me all kinds of problems. And oh, you got me going now. Sorry.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, same thing with like barberry. People, I mean, I cannot tell you how many Lowe's, Home Depots, other places that you go and there's a whole row of barberry that they still sell. And let me tell you how hard it is to try and remove them from native habitats out in the wild. They are horrible species. If I could, I would put some chemical on my arm and just like run him over the top of him as I walk down the aisle, but I can't. I want to, but I can't. They are horrible species. Don't buy them. If they're in Europe, please get rid of them. Rochelle put another reason to use native plants. Many cities have banned bird feeders because of rats. So that is something to consider, as well as maybe say avian influenza is another problem in the spring next year. By planting these natives, whether it's avian influenza, maybe bird feeders aren't allowed. Maybe it's you just want to see more variety of species in your yard besides just bird feeder birds. Native plants are wonderful. Richard mentioned mosquito control more important than bird feeder restrictions. Yeah, it really depends on who you talk to, but yeah, controlling insects isn't always great, but birds do help with controlling insects. And so that's something to keep in mind, is by attracting these birds, you actually are getting a natural way to manage insects that you don't necessarily want in your yard. Another person put, can I just wash out a bird feeder to clean it out, or would it require sterilization with perhaps bleach? I am in Southern California, so I'm not sure if the avian flu referred to this in my area. So again, you can find out more of those details with your local DNR, especially if you're in a different state. We can't necessarily tell you what would or wouldn't be better. Even just in Michigan, I mean, depending on what county you're in, avian influenza can be worse or better in certain areas. I recommend checking your local DNR always. They will keep you up to date on how things are looking. But also another thing to keep in mind, that a good place that always is really up to date on how it's looking in your area is your local Wild Birds Unlimited. When it comes to your bird feeders, they know everything and all that you need to know when it comes to your bird feeders, whether it's how avian influenza is a problem, maybe the best ways to clean it. I do recommend contacting your local Wild Birds Unlimited, and they are found across the United States. So I do recommend contacting them for that answer. Richard put vaccinate your chicken farms against bird flu. Yes, absolutely. Right now in our area, the biggest things that they are influencing are your waterfowl, your domestic creatures such as chickens, and then your raptors. And so, but again, that's all different based on what area you're in. So those are what they're mostly influencing right now. So do keep in mind to take care of your creatures. Keith, he put your look up your native plant finder. Andrew put, do you recommend planting milkweed?
Yeah, that's a good one. Obviously, host plant for monarch butterflies, you know, that is a very charismatic species that draws a lot of eyes because they're beautiful, they're big, you can see them, and you know, they were a big part of a lot of people's childhoods, so they kind of get people going. in terms of planting efforts. So milkweed is one that I've found to be easier to find, which is nice. I would caution against going too hog wild with the milkweed. I just last 2 weekends ago when I was doing some yard work, planted some milkweed in the back. I think it's a great thing to add if it's native to your area, which it is through most of the US. But having said that, again, we want to focus on diversity too. So don't, make all these awesome ecological efforts and plant like, your entire front yard full of milkweed, nothing else. Again, monocultures are kind of a problem because they're somewhat limited in what they can offer. So milkweed as, one element in your native landscape is great. All good on that. Just make sure you're getting that diversity too.
Lori put, do not dump worms in forests. Again, kind of keeping in mind, like Keith kind of said, right tree, right place, right species, right place. So being aware that some species aren't necessarily good in all places. So keep that in mind. Southeast Michigan group put Dearborn's tree ordinance regulates cutting trees over 16 inches in diameter on private property. Are there other cities you know of that have similar requirements?
Yes, definitely. Novi has a similar ordinance. I won't get too into the weeds on it, but basically if a portion of your property is determined to be regulated woodland or wetland, it is protected in terms of, the ground cover is protected in other ways, but in terms of trees, anything 8 inches in diameter at chest height or greater is protected. And to cut that, you need permit and potentially you need to replace it, that sort of thing. A lot of times those rules are in place to obviously protect our natural areas and stop people from buying up a big woodlot, clearing the whole thing, throwing up a bunch of houses, and then taking off to go clear out the next lot. So people get touchy because, well, it's my private property. I should be able to do whatever I want. And yes, you can to an extent, but you're removing this vital habitat that has been recognized to be of great environmental import. If you want to do that to lay down some more grass that's not going to support any wildlife, then you're going to need to replace it. That's kind of how our ordinance works. You can replace it with trees on your own property, or if you don't want the trees, you just want the grass, you're not wired the same way, you can pay into the city's tree fund. We'll replace that tree elsewhere where it's needed. And then it's, sort of helps balance that loss of the canopy. So those rules do exist. I think they're somewhat common, especially with the cities that earn that Tree City USA designation. You may have seen that on some signs around you. That is currently being challenged in the state of Michigan. It's actually quite a point of contention. There's some, I guess, anxiety that maybe those rules will go away because of state law. And we're all kind of waiting to see what happens with that and what the outcome will be. But, me being the urban forester, finding great value in wooded areas and not wanting to see them all cleared for condos, I would really like those rules to stay in place, protecting our natural areas. But I guess we'll just have to see what shakes out.
Yeah. So Richard put avoid crowded chicken farms. So kind of like what Keith mentioned, no matter what species you have, say you're planting your yard, keep in mind that it's great to have, it looks really pretty to have maybe all the same trees going down your front driveway or along your fence line, but you're actually doing a disservice to your local ecosystem by doing that, and also increasing the chances of spreading diseases. So like alternating what species you have, maybe not crowding things. I mean, crowding and using one species that's how you end up spreading diseases. And it's the same thing, whether it's chickens, whether it's birds, whether it's trees, shrubs, flowers. I mean, really diversity is important. But also making sure that things, it's not healthy to be too crowded. So that's same thing with the chickens. He also put, what does removing a circular strip of bark do to your tree, as illustrated on the end picture?
Yeah, it really depends. To be clear, I did not do this to this tree. This is something that I found on a walk up around Traverse City. It really depends on the depth of the damage. Most people don't recognize that pretty much all the living parts of the trees are around the outside. The center of a tree is all pretty inert. It's not really doing anything. It's mostly there for, structure. The cambium, which is where everything kind of moves and shakes, is right around the outside circumference of the tree. So if you're stripping away bark, that's one thing. It's still not good, but could be worse. If you're stripping away cambium, which is also in that sort of outer layer, then you can kill the tree by cutting a circle like this. I don't recall if this tree was dead. It's been some years since I saw it, but to be clear and clear my name, I did not do this to this tree.
Wonderful. Well, not wonderful. We don't like when trees are killed. I don't know if any of you are like me, but whenever I pass by a place and I see a stump that I knew was a tree the day before, oh, it gets me a mixture of sad and my blood boiling. I cannot stand to see a tree cut down. It serves their purpose depending on the situation, but one thing I actually recently had planted in my yard, which I personally love, and I hope more schools incorporate this. Maybe you can mention it to your local schools. This high school near my house, they actually did this huge fundraiser where you could order trees, and they had 3 different varieties: redbud, paper birch, and a maple, I believe. Would have been great if it was an oak, but that's okay. I got a couple of birches planted because I already had redbuds and maples and oaks in my yard. And so I got a couple birches planted. And the purpose of this fundraiser is the high schoolers come out, they plant them for you. But it's to offset the paper that they use every year at school. And so it's really a great way to kind of show that they care about the environment, supporting more planting of trees in your area. But it's also just a really great way to get high schoolers involved with nature and the environment. And so something I am really happy, they just came over about 2 weeks ago, planted my trees. And here soon I'll put some mulch around them and hopefully really encourage their growth over the years. And so, yeah, I guess at this point, those were the last of the chat comments. Any other questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself if you want to. We are a little after 1, it's 1:15, so we're a little past what we really thought we would be at, but any other questions, feel free, and otherwise we'll get going.
Yeah, and I put my email way back here at the beginning, so if anyone wants to follow up there, feel free.
Awesome. And so for everybody else, no one's writing anything else, so feel free to email me if you didn't see his email. I can always share that later as well. Keith is just a wealth of knowledge. So I do encourage, if you ever have the chance, to just pick his brain. And otherwise, thank you so much for coming. We're happy you could come. And we will share this webinar link at the end or over the next couple days. So yeah, thanks, Keith. Thanks, everybody. And have a good evening or afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.